And so this program wasn't really geared towards those people. It was geared more towards people who are trying to figure out how do they create a better future for themselves or potentially their families. And, McDonald's then provides a pathway for people to do that.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Milverton, CEO of Links Educate. This is Talent is Everywhere. We're here to talk about how to keep talent and how to develop talent in order to build a strong business. We'll interview leaders to hear their best experiences of how they invested in people. Well, hi, Rob.
Hi, Sylvia.
Thanks for joining us today on our inaugural episode of Talent is Everywhere. I wanted to talk to you today especially about your experience at McDonald's when you were launching Archways for Opportunity. Maybe even before sharing what that was, you can take us back to that moment when you decided to explore it. What was happening at McDonald's and how did the project even start?
Yeah, two things. I think one was when I started at McDonald's, the conversation was beginning already and was already underway, I think, at McDonald's. I had done some work at Yum Brands, where I was before McDonald's, around sort of education access for employees. And we had done some work at Taco Bell specifically on Learn Más. So I started talking about that. That was part of my interview conversations, actually, because I thought McDonald's was a great place to really expand that thinking and respond, I think, to the college access program that Starbucks had at the time in terms of what we could do to attract people and what we could do to really create a force for good, I think, as a brand and as an organization. So there were some early conversations that had happened before I walked in the door, but as I got in the door, the conversations accelerated then towards how do we actually get something moving on it. So very quickly we were into thinking about, what's the infrastructure that we need in place? What's the, what's the funding look like from an investment perspective? And then how do we test and learn our way into the process and really, understand what's going to work, what's going to resonate, and what might not resonate with people.
So what did you end up building? What was the structure of the program when you first launched?
Yeah, when we first launched, it was career online high school and it was college access programs. And we had, I think at the time when we first launched, we had like 9 different universities we were affiliating with, but we also told people that they could go to any school that they wanted to. And so we started there, and we started at a smaller investment amount, $750 a year for crew and $1,000 a year for restaurant managers. And so we started at a smaller investment amount really to test and learn, I would say, in terms of gauging people's interest, gauging people's reaction, trying to figure out what the right dollar amount was. Does $750 a year actually move the needle, or is that really just sort of a teaser in terms of an entry point for people? And so I'd say that's the place where we really started, was with an offering similar to that.
Interesting. And so in terms of move the needle, was the success, obviously you were trying to balance your monetary investment with people actually signing up, but what was the vision of McDonald's? Obviously compete with what Starbucks was offering, but was the idea okay, we need to be able to hire more people, we need to retain them better, we actually want just people at McDonald's to have gone to college so that they're better employees?
Yeah, I think a broad spectrum of things. I think there was this, there was this overarching theme that McDonald's can be a force for good in terms of, people working there. So I think there was a combination of a few things. One was we wanted to fundamentally change the thinking about a job at McDonald's from sort of the McJob idea of where it's a dead end and people that can't get jobs anywhere else, you're the employer of last resort. So I think we wanted to really make a change there in terms of saying, actually, we're the employer of first resort, really the first place you should come, because we can build your capabilities to go on and do great things elsewhere. And the Archways program would be, a demonstrable way to sit there and say, that here's a proof point, frankly, where we can show that that's actually possible. So I think that was one. I think the second one was also then around, how do we create a more compelling avenue for people to want to come to work at McDonald's? So like every organization out there, talent shortages come and go, and, market shortages come and go. But, at the front line, hourly population, job shortages and talent pipeline are persistent issues in the organization, have been in most of the frontline organizations I've ever worked in, and still are today. I'm talking to some manufacturers where it's a real issue. So getting people to, sort of answering the question about why should I want to come to work there was an important piece that we thought needed a response with something we could point to that we knew interested at a percentage of the population, but we also knew it would, again, change the narrative about why people would want to work there. And then the third one was really around, McDonald's has this long history through Hamburger University and other pieces of being a developer of people. And we wanted to take it a step further, I think, in terms of opening doors for people and creating opportunities for people. And that was one way to do it.
Oh, that's interesting. So you said a lot of things in there, and I'll come back to some of it. But what about just the initial idea? We both are talking a lot about frontline workers and companies, and I feel like there's a bias, like people in those kind of hourly frontline positions, like why would you invest in such people, like that they're not academic people? The reality of McDonald's is there's a store that has 30 or 40 people in it and maybe 1, 2, 3 managers. And so that, internal mobility story, it's there, but it isn't that compelling. And yet McDonald's still makes this huge investment in investing in college. And I'm just interested in, how that resonates and what other people said about those ideas.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of conversation in the early days about sort of how big do we want it to get and how big do we think it can get, right? So lots of conversations around, do we move more in a scholarship direction where we can be sort of more limiting in who we pick and how much we spend, or do we sort of leave the gate open and say, whoever wants to come forward can come forward and take advantage of this. That was the notion that actually ended up prevailing, with some, sort of best guess work around what we thought participation rates would really look like in the organization. So we assumed somewhere between 3 and 5% would actually take advantage of the opportunity. And that's largely panned out to be true, I would say, in terms of participation rates. But when you have an organization in the U.S. where there's 750,000 people, that number gets in the tens of thousands when you're talking about 3 or 5%. So it and then the multiplier on that in terms of the financial commitment became an important piece of the conversation as well. Because obviously, like McDonald's, although McDonald's has, lots of resources available to it from a financial and cash flow perspective, like any organization, you want to make sure you don't actually do damage to that, and remember that you're there to sort of serve the constituents, meaning the customer and the shareholder as well. So lots of good conversation around that, I would say, up front in terms of thinking about how we go, and that's what drove a lot of sort of the test and learn thinking for us up front. Was let's really understand what supply and demand is going to look like, particularly when we were going kind of blind into this. We didn't really have a precedent setting measure out there, or frankly at the time other companies really to even benchmark against, to sit there. I think Walmart and Starbucks were probably the two closest benchmark opportunities. And even then, it's 2015, it was early days in terms of thinking about that.
And how did you get, was it hard to get buy-in, like both from, senior management, CFO, CEO, or was that, say, part of the stated objective? And then also on the other side, like all your franchisees where they're literally investing, well, at first $750 and now I suppose up to about $5,000.
Yeah, I think a couple things. On the executive side, I think we tried to think about tangible things from an ROI perspective and intangible things from an ROI perspective. So we had a set of hypotheses, I would say, in terms of going forward, right? Because ROI is great because it always looks backwards. So, if you're doing some predictive ROI, great. Here's what I would say. We looked at, we had a hypothesis that said we thought that people that participated in the program would stay longer. So that we could tie to a tangible value from a store performance perspective. Stores that have more tenure period in their crew populations outperform those that don't. For lots of variable reasons behind that. But, we believed that if we launched this program, people that participated would stay longer. Second one was that we believed that we could change our brand perception of McDonald's as an employer, and that had consumer value. So our marketing leader at the time, had sort of brand health measures on how McDonald's was perceived as an employer by its consumers. And we knew that if we were able to move that, 5 points, it would equate into a certain amount of revenue or frequency improvements on the customer side. So we talked about those two, I would say, were the biggest sort of conversations around, justification for it from a hypothesis perspective.
Mm-hmm. And what about like the store owners? Did they see like definite return, like that they were okay to invest those kind of numbers?
Yeah, well, interestingly, up until 2021, franchisees didn't really have to pay for any of it. So they were the 100% beneficiaries of McDonald's investment at the time. So franchisees were easy, I would say, in that context, in terms of they didn't have to get their wallets out and write a check for every person that participated at the time. They do now. It's much more of a cost sharing model today than it was then. And interestingly, participation is largely the same as it's been. So franchisees are believers now. But we knew that we also needed to sort of prove it out with our franchisees before we asked them to actually mutually invest with us. And so the first 5 years, frankly, of the program were about really proving that out with them. So it became easy on the financial side for the franchisees to get involved. Where it became challenging was sort of helping them understand how to engage their employees in the process. Understanding that we didn't mean everyone immediately. We meant, one of our mantras was around literally one per restaurant, right? What we believed was that if we could get one participant per restaurant, one that would be about between 13 and 14,000 people, and two, that one person could sort of create the environment where other people would be curious about it. Other people would see success, and other people would then want to sort of join in and participate. So sort of the fundamentals of trying to make something go viral, I guess would be the other way to look at it. So we kept back to franchisees, we kept the ask really small, and we minimized the financial investment they needed to make to do it. And they were largely receptive to it as a result.
It's thinking about this kind of learning, like I spend all my time thinking about this kind of learning, what to call it. In the US, you can call it, tuition reimbursement, ed benefits. In Europe, we have to talk about, deep skilling or, the skills to, get a new job. And what's interesting is I feel like there's this like natural participation level of 3 to 5%. And the way, you're framing it for McDonald's, like your vision of success was one person per store out of a store of 30 or 40 people. And it's just interesting if you think of, a wide access learning tool. Like if you say, listen, I'm going to invest in, a content library and 3% of my employees are using it, you'd think, well, this is one big giant disaster. Whereas this type of learning, in fact, the success is to get to this sweet spot of 3 to 5%. I talk to HR leaders all the time, and a lot of these programs are different. And like that framing of like low, it's not low participation, it's in this context that's high. How can we talk about that? Like, how can we think about that in a constructive way? Like, oh, I launched this thing, 3% of my employees are enrolled, and it's a home run.
Well, yeah. Well, there's a lot behind that. I think one is on anything, having a realistic view on what you think the participation rates are going to look like is better, right? So I actually think we should go in and talk more about, things that might have a 10% participation rate and call that a success, because that's our expectation. Right. Whereas, like I know in the L&D profession, we often go off and buy big content libraries, deploy it to all our employees, sort of, applaud our democratization of access to learning content, and then get less than 1% participation. And then realize that we just licensed it for thousands of people when really, fewer than 100 are actually taking advantage of it. And so part of that is around sort of being realistic in our expectations, I think, is one. Two, I think it's actually easier to go in and talk about the business case when you're being realistic about participation rates and conservative, frankly. I'd say realistic about participation rates and potentially even, more conservative about participation rates in a way that's believable more than saying, we think, we're going to get hundreds of thousands of people immediately to sign up for this thing. So I'd say, that was an important element that we wanted to bring, was a bit of realism to what we thought would happen when we did this. And we were, again, back to sort of business case, we were very explicit about what from a business benefit perspective, the needles were that we were trying to move. And then, on the tangible side, like tenure and attraction. And then we were also very clear about the intangible benefits that it would provide McDonald's. So one of them was, how we'd be able to talk about our role in, American society as an employer. So, the best evidence of that is the commercials that talked about America's best first job, right? And sort of claiming, because no one had, that we're the best place for people to start their career, no matter who you are, where you come from, what means you have or whatever. We're the best place to start your job because, right? Well, because of the program that we have, because of the opportunities that we create, and those types of things.
That makes sense. And to also think that there's like a natural, these kind of programs, they take time, right? Because you're going to be outside of work studying 10 to 15 hours, 20 hours a week. And so there's some like natural selection. And so maybe it's almost like for a company like McDonald's, you also, you don't want to invest, say, $1 billion a year. Like if you had 20% of all McDonald's employees, that would probably, maybe be a great scenario in your investment. But, in terms of the balance.
It'd be a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at today's rates, 20% of that, 750,000 would be basically 150,000 people, and times $2,500 each per year, you're talking about $250 million investment every year. Now, that would be fantastic and a great thing to talk about, and I think there are organizations out there that can scale that big, but McDonald's is not one of them because of the way we operate, as a highly franchised organization. But I do think that $250 million might not be that bad as long as you've cut turnover down by, 80% and people are really staying longer, and you've seen a $1 billion increase in sales. Right? People would probably get behind that and say, okay, that's not a bad investment for us, even though it's a frighteningly large number.
Right. But I suppose, right, if you have the kind of people working for you where they're valuing, well, of course, and we go around different people, you're different in your life. Some people are going to value flexibility of their time. Some people need more salary. Some people, want to live close to work. We all have different points in your life. But I suppose if you have the type of workforce where there's lots of people in a moment where they're like, I want education for myself or for someone in my family, and I want it to be sponsored, that's like an amazing lever to reduce those operational difficulties.
Yeah, because we know that many people in our organization come to work there and, can't afford access, I think it would be a best way to say, can't afford access to higher education, even though they're eminently capable of handling it. So, and you're right. And I think, one of the levers that we played around with was eligibility. For example, when we started, when we first started the program, we wanted 9 months of tenure before you became eligible to participate in the program. When we dropped that to 90 days, we dropped it to 90 days and we raised the dollar amount in 2017, I guess it was, or 2018. We saw numbers, quadruple. So we knew we found the sweet spot that way in terms of being able to do it. It also unlocked our ability to talk about, sort of college access, 2-year degree, and 4-year degree access being free. So to the participants. So even then, we sort of learned our way towards what the sort of sweet spots were that really drove the right amount of engagement against sort of the population that could consume it. Because I think you're right. There's a huge portion of the population of McDonald's that just wants schedule flexibility because they maybe work another job or they do other things or they have they have life going on around them. And so this program wasn't really geared towards those people. It was geared more towards people who are trying to figure out how do they create a better future for themselves or potentially their families. And, McDonald's then provides a pathway for people to do that.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because, when you do surveys, BCG, it did some really interesting research last year on frontline workers globally. And they talked to, thousands of workers across, US, Europe, Asia about different benefits, how can you keep your frontline workers? What makes them leave? What makes them stay? And in fact, education benefits specifically, don't come up. They will talk a lot about wanting career development, will talk a lot about wanting, training, but, those words can mean a lot of different things. And probably if you're only going to get, a 3 to 5% uptake, it probably wouldn't come up in those kind of surveys. But it's so interesting to think about, this is this amazing lever where with a key investment, you can drive this outsized impact, even if 97% of the people aren't using it, but you're still able to change the employment value proposition of a huge company like McDonald's. It's actually incredible.
Well, because it was interesting, some interesting behaviors around it. So for some, as the program began to develop and get momentum, some franchisees actually then started including questions about educational aspirations in their interview process, right? There was one franchisee that, had 3 restaurants, had probably 150 people. I think had 88 people in the program, right? So way, 60% participation in the program. But when you turned around and talked to her about, gosh, how did you get it so high? She's like, I'm only hiring people that want to participate in this program. So, so come to work here and in exchange, not only will I pay you, but I'll help pay for your education. Is a pretty appealing piece to some people. So I think it's, what segment of the population are you trying to attract? And, I think it's also around, the education piece really is about creating career mobility for people. So people that want career development and career advancement and those types of pieces. Many McDonald's crew employees realize that they need to unlock their educational attainment to be able to do that in a large portion of, other jobs that they might go to.
Yeah. Which gets me to my other question that I was going to ask you, around the practical things. So you said you started out where you pick the programs, but they could also do their other one, something that they choose. What did you end up finding out just about, is it important that the manager approve it in the system? Is it important that people can take whatever they want? Is it important to store managers to know that the type of education they're paying for covers X, Y, and Z and not other irrelevant topics or something?
Yeah, I think we were pretty straightforward around sort of accredited programs, talking about 2-year and 4-year schools, those types of pieces. So we hadn't really got into the whole certification realm. I think today that would be a bigger conversation than it was then. And so it was fairly clear that way in terms of sort of eligibility and how it worked. A couple things behind sort of manager and in McDonald's case franchise or franchisee approval for people to participate in the program. Two things. I think one is we needed a checkpoint, right? Are you actually an employee or not? And since you're not an employee of McDonald's, you're an employee of the franchisee. The logical way for us to check that is through the franchisee. So that was one. The second thing that it did, though, was it triggered the franchisee awareness about people participating in the program. And many of the franchisees at McDonald's run their businesses like family businesses. And oftentimes have family members involved in their businesses or are second or third generation owners. So being aware that somebody in your organization is trying to advance their education gave that franchisee an opportunity to sort of put their arm around that person and support them, champion them. A lot of them did recognition when people hit milestones like finished high school or finished their 2-year degree or, were on their way to their 4-year degree, would find moments to recognize them in store, with things like cakes and graduation gowns and, restaurant celebrations and those kind of things that really made people feel good about the accomplishment and recognized. And I think that also helped promote the program. And I think further, inspired other people to say, hey, I want to be a part of that too. If someone in my restaurant's done it, I have someone I can talk to about it, what challenges they faced. And now I have sort of a peer support system to help me navigate through. And so I think some of those things we saw as sort of viral pieces that we thought could make a difference. And that's why, one per restaurant really seems like a small impact, but really is sort of the way to start building yourself towards momentum more than trying to sort of boil the ocean all at once.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And that's what I've been so passionate about learning and implementing these kind of programs. It's just like such an incredible tool to get outsized impact. We tend to think like, let's invest in, executive MBA programs for our senior leaders, which, great. But that person is already fairly advanced. The return you're going to get on the investment in someone that's done fewer things and has further to go is, that's where you get these amazing impact.
Yeah. And I think executive ed's important. Don't get me wrong on that. Right. But I think you're right in terms of, for a lot of frontline driven organizations, getting people to stay longer is worth a lot to the organization from a money perspective, from a compensation perspective, from an ease and performance perspective. Lots of different things get impacted by sort of novice skill sets in the environment. And so, it's interesting because I don't believe that there's enough conversation about sort of getting people to stay longer. The conversation is more about sort of persistent turnover, right? And, and frontline jobs are naturally going to have persistent turnover because people typically go to those frontline jobs during a stage of their life, right? Where they might be pursuing education somewhere else or might need extra cash for a part-time job, right? So all those people get factored into turnover probably unfairly. Instead of thinking about, how do I create a place where people want to come to work there, feel like they belong there? How do I give them the flexibility that they need to work when they want or potentially where they want, depending on the organization? And then, how do I help, what role do I play as an employer in helping people realize the future that they want, or maybe even helping discover a future that they didn't even know they could get? I think those three things are super important for employers to think about, and there's giant returns on the operational side of the business to do that.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and maybe that's a good message to end on. I guess I'll ask you just a couple more questions. Just thinking about your CLO role, given the space of that program, how did that fit into your overall job in terms of managing, Hamburger University and high potentials and executive learning? Like, how did this fit into the landscape of your work?
Yeah, I'd say it was an important piece of what we did. It was certainly, one of my favorite pieces of what we did. I think that, I had a team and a woman named Lisa Schumacher, who's still running the program today, was like instrumental in making it happen and, cared a lot about it and still cares a lot about it. And I think that, that helped tremendously, where I could then focus on sort of, bigger burning platform issues in the organization, like, how do we advance the strategy around digital and delivery and those kind of pieces as well. So it fit as part of the overall advancing the agenda of the organization. It was just one dimension of all the things that we were trying to do.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it actually, I'm glad that you say that too, because, what's tough in L&D is that there's so very many tools out there and so very many, you've got a lot of work and, not one tool solves every problem. And so seeing it in an overall landscape.
Well, and there's no shortage of priorities, right? And most people, will find, will tell you that they probably have more work than they can actually handle. And sometimes these things become sort of aspirational, but I do think that there's an organizational imperative that people can make these initiatives into very easily, that fits into sort of reputation and longevity, and even really strongly into future talent pipelines in organizations.
That's great. Well, thanks, Rob, so much for sharing us this story. I'm sure you know that as I was founding Links and thinking of the different things we can do in Europe and how to advance this story of Archways and McDonald's and what a lot of companies like Starbucks, Walmart, and others have done is such an inspiration. So yeah, it's been great to hear the story and to have a chance to talk about it.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Talent is Everywhere. Make sure to subscribe if you like what you heard and give us a follow on LinkedIn to continue the conversation on all things career mobility and talent development. Is there a topic you'd love for us to cover in a future episode or a guest you'd recommend? Drop us an email at hello@linkseducate.com. And if you're looking for support on your talent development strategy, head over to linkseducate.com to learn more about our career mobility solution. That's LYNXeducate.com.